All of the burning and bombing that was done to us and the houses, nobody never said too much about that, and nothing was done. But let something be burned, by a black man, and then, my God, You see, the flag is drenched with our blood, because, you see, so many of our ancestors was killed because we have never accepted slavery. We had to live on it, but we've never wanted it. So we know that this flag is drenched with our blood. So what the young people are saying now, give us a chance to be young men, respected as a man, as we know this country was built on the black backs of black people across this country. And if we don't have it, you ain't gonna have it either, because we gonna tear it up.
During the Civil Rights era, freedom was conditional. Racism was common. The cities were torn apart. And one man was responsible for leading D.C. out of despair, Walter E. Washington.
If you're asking whether the city is going to be appropriately protected, I would say it will be.
He was the first black chief executive of a major city and the first elected mayor of D.C. In 1967, 3 black men were chosen to lead major cities in the U.S., Richard Hatcher, Carl Stokes, and of course, Walter Washington. Mayor Washington was the great-grandson of enslaved American people. He was born 1915 in Dawson, Georgia, but raised in Jamestown, New York. Education was the top priority for Walter. As a child, it was said that he was usually the only black student in class. So after finishing up grade school in New York, he came to D.C. to go to Howard University, and it was like a culture shock seeing so many black folks. In an interview he did later on in 1966, he said he was thrilled and amazed by the black student body, but also devastated at the fact that D.C. was a segregated city. From there, he got his bachelor's degree and later went further at Howard Law School, where he earned his law degree in 1948.
To have this opportunity to...
Walter lived at 408 T Street in the Leroy Park neighborhood with his first wife, Bonetta Bullock, the daughter of a pastor. And that marriage sort of sealed the deal as far as support and acceptance amongst a secret society of black folks, for lack of a better term. Basically, the educated and socially advanced black folks in the area. The Victorian-style house that they lived in was owned by Bonetta's family, and in the article from the Washington Post, the Bullocks, who came from North Carolina, were called one of the first families of black Washington. The black church once upon a time was the foundation of the community, and Walter Washington married the daughter of a very influential preacher. He even built relationships with other churches in the city and became an unofficial legal advisor for years. Those relationships gave him a lot of support later on in the political space. But as far as employment, Walter worked for the ADA, that's the Alley Dwelling Authority, providing low-rent housing in the city. And that later changed to the National Capital Housing Authority, where he became the executive director in 1961. Then after 5 years, he moved on to a much larger housing agency back in New York. But that only lasted less than a year due to the fact that Walter was offered and eventually accepted the role as mayor commissioner of Washington, D.C. Walter Washington was a safe choice for the president, respected among the black elites in the city, as well as the whites, but the president didn't want him to have control over the police department. He thought it should be the federal government who controlled him, but Walter refused to accept the role if he did not have control over the police department. So LBJ was pushing for an independent city government with a city council and one appointed mayor commissioner, while still having Congress overseeing the money, aka the city budget. Some powerful people were against the legislation. Certain whites were on board, but they wanted a white mayor. So a meeting was held at the White House. One of the top choices who was mentioned was a lawyer named Edward Bennett Williams. But President Johnson wanted a black man, Roy Wilkins, the one-time chief of the NAACP. But Wilkins declined the offer, and that's when Walter Washington's name came up. So there was some pushback from some important white figures not liking the idea of a black man having control over the police department. Robert Byrd was a Democrat from West Virginia. He used to organize and lead a local Ku Klux Klan group in the 1940s, but later renounced it for obvious reasons. He rose to a very powerful position in the Senate in the 50s and the 60s.
Robert Byrd opposed the idea of Walter Washington controlling the police department.
At that moment, Byrd was chairman of the D.C. Senate Committee. Racial tension was still very high around that time, and some people were very vocal about where they stood. But the president looked past all of that and made Walter Washington mayor commissioner in 1967. Now, prior to 1967, the city was ran by a 3-commissioner government since 1871. The president's plan was to go with a more modern style with 1 commissioner and a 9-member city council. So the name commissioner changed to mayor commissioner and stayed consistent from 1967 and 1973 when the law changed to having elected mayors involving campaigns and votes from the people. A couple years prior to Walter Washington taking the position as mayor commissioner, a young black charismatic civil rights activist born in Mississippi, Marion Barry, was now in D.C., organizing, demonstrating, and leading the Free D.C. movement, focusing on underprivileged areas. He was out front protesting, leading a bus boycott and more, and of course he went on to do even more great work in the city. Later on down the line, Marion Barry and Walter Washington would have to battle it out politically in the 1978 mayor election.
That you're wearing, what does it represent?
I say it represents black power.
5 months after Mayor Washington took office, he faced one of his most difficult tasks, having to address the rioting on the streets after Dr. King was assassinated.
The tragic death this evening of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Really a shock, but...
Well, I was shocked.
Well, I think it's terrible, man.
I think it's terrible.
Some of the biggest riots broke out in Chicago, Kansas City, Baltimore, and of course D.C. Certain powers that be wanted law enforcement to shoot the looters. Allegedly, J. Edgar Hoover was one of those powerful people that made the suggestion, but was not allegedly is
Spiro Agnew, former Vice President of the United States and former Governor of Maryland.
Spiro Agnew stated that the police would be justified in shooting the suspected looter, regardless if they were dangerous or not. His exact words were, "When you try to arrest somebody and he runs, the police has to stop him by any means necessary, and if that includes shooting him, he has to shoot him." Mayor Washington was totally against shooting people, and not only that, he also went into the community himself hoping to calm the situation and encourage young people to go home. But of course, many people took to the streets burning buildings, taking items, and no community activist or mayor was able to prevent this from happening. Some were angry, and some were looking to get away with some products.
Paul, can you tell me about the shrunken head that you're wearing? What does it represent?
I say it represents black power.
Mm-hmm. Paul, you participated in the riots. Can you tell us why you had a part in them?
I had a part in it because where I live at is 5 stories high, and I could see my cleaners. And I saw them burning down my cleaners. So I say, why shouldn't I get something and everybody burn down my clothes, take my clothes out, and do what they want to do? So I'm going to go in the store and get what I want, and I had what I want then.
Mm-hmm. They took they burned down the cleaners where your clothes were?
Yes, sir.
Did you feel it was a crime when you were taking part?
Yes, I did.
But it didn't bother you any?
No,
Why?
I needed me a couple of clothes, pants, shoes, so I just grabbed some and took it on home with me.
What did you have in mind doing when you left home, went out into the street?
I had in mind going up Max's on 14th Street to go get my sweater shirt out.
You had a sweatshirt up there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
A new one?
Brand new.
What do you mean, you had bought it and hadn't picked it up, or what?
No, it was in the layaway. I had put $15 down on it, and I owed 10.
This way you got it without paying the 10?
Well, I didn't exactly get it. I got something else in place of it.
That's so. You don't think the death of Martin Luther King had anything to do with the rioting?
Some of them, they did it because of Martin Luther King, and some of them didn't. Some of them did it because they just needed clothes for Easter, and they didn't have money to get it.
The National Guard was called in to help the cops. 13 people were killed. There was already a disconnect between law enforcement and black people in America. And in 1968, a whopping 80% of the police force in D.C. was white, but 67% of the population was black. Some of those cops abused their power and even committed murder that wasn't justified. That same year, after the riot, a black man was shot and killed by a police officer simply for jaywalking. The old 13th precinct is where everyone gathered to protest, and everyone from reporters, the head of police, Mayor Washington, and people from the community showed up and were allowed to speak, as well as the mayor, who told the people that he will work to get the results they were looking for, but he also reminded them of an even greater issue within black neighborhoods.
I will work very hard as I can, to get the matter as close as possible to what the citizens want. In fact, some of you, it'll be good for you to go through the ghetto where I live, and on the way see some of the conditions that are there, which I don't think were made, by virtue of those that are there.
1 year later, it was back to the regular scheduled program for the mayor. He always been an advocate of equal housing opportunities and quality living conditions for all.
This is a part of the Model Cities area. This is a part of Shaw. This is a part of Northwest 1. And the years and years of neglect, suddenly somebody comes alive and starts working on it. And this is what you've got to do with your entire city.
Residents were dealing with rats, garbage everywhere, completely unsanitary.
Have you tried stuffing things in there, bottles or can or something like that?
No,
Or will the rats kick it out?
I wouldn't think do no good because the rat's big as a cat.
The rats are how big?
They're
are
great big.
How
Them
big
great
are the
big
rats?
rats. Them is
Yeah.
big rats.
Yeah. Now, do they go after your food supply in the kitchen too?
Well, I'll tell you, what they do, they come in and they get to the bed and it runs all through the room. You can't sleep. You can't even sleep for them. Well, they sound like somebody fighting in the house. That's the truth.
Can you hear them in the walls
You
at
can
night?
hear them. Well, one of them cornered my daughter. She was coming down the steps. My 11-year-old daughter was coming downstairs to use this bathroom, but none of these bathrooms works in this house. They're not fitting. They're really not. Because every time you use them, they overflood, and I have called that man and told him about it, and he called and said, tell him Green, come on, these things is not no good. They are even leaking from the bottom, and everything runs downstairs in the living room.
Do you have problems with rats?
Rats, yeah, rats get in the bed with the kids.
At night, are you fearful of
night,
rats?
yes, we
How
do.
How do you protect the children?
I have to
at
keep
night?
the lights, burn the electric lights all night.
Even look at the dog in there. It doesn't look.
And as the first mayor of the city since the 1800s, and being a black man who doesn't have the edge to force Congress' hand, it was a lose-lose situation. This is backed by people way more intelligent than myself who spoke on behalf of the mayor, later mentioning the lack of respect that was had for the mayor from the government. Just look at how he was breaking down the root cause and what needed to be done, and how even these guys just turned away from what he was saying, cutting them off and everything. Listen.
Mayor, even if it were only cosmetic, suppose, would it even be desirable in a morale sense to send a team in to just clean up the debris and kill a lot of rats?
This is done every week. The cosmetic part of it, and it comes back. You can't just do cosmetics. You got to get to the root of the problem. You got to work with the families, and the families have a problem with this, and you've got to get around the cosmetics. This is what everybody wants to do, a cosmetic job. My God, that's what we've been doing years and years. This is what
we're about to have some here.
You can make excuses and say, oh, man, he wasn't aggressive enough. He didn't make them respect his proposals. But I think it's more to it than that. I think it's more complex. A black mayor leading the city was not common, especially during a time where we had extreme racial division and Congress still sat above him as an overseer of the city budget. Mayor Washington was a very content, peaceful mayor who believed blacks should focus on education and hard work. If I had to sum him up according to reports, interviews, and opinions of some of the people close to him, I'd say he was a pretty fair man who understood we need balance. You gotta give a little to get a little. He believed blacks should be respectful, presentable, men should be stoic, as he was in all public situations, work hard and respect the law, but also he believed police brutality had no place in society. Mayor Washington might have been liked by Congress, but not necessarily respected when it came to his authority or proposed innovative ideas that got shot down. And still, I saw no complaints or videos of him bad-mouthing the government. The only thing I saw was a mayor that did what he could under a system of white supremacy. He led the city out of the 68 riots, got elected in the 70s just one time from 75 to 79, but times were changing. Mayor Washington's style was outdated. People were angry, broke, and even more resistant. They needed someone with more fire inside of them, someone they could identify with more, someone elected by the people and 100% for the people. And Mayor Marion Barry was that guy who won the election in 1979. But Mayor Washington's career achievements are definitely admirable. From completing higher education to working for and with blacks living at or below the poverty line, becoming the head of the ADA, to mayor commissioner, and being the first elected mayor since 1871. Before Walter Washington, those higher up positions in DC government were all white. Someone had to be the first. According to James L. Hudson, a lawyer and ex-supporter of Mayor Washington, a black man couldn't make it to the 5th floor of the district building. Walter Washington eliminated that. Thanks for watching, man. Shout out all the people who stuck around to the end of this video, man. We got some cool photos here I wanted to add in. First up is Mayor Washington with Marvin Gaye in 1970. Marvin Gaye, a native of DC, was accepting the key to the city from the mayor. In this photo, you got the mayor with some hostages who were finally released after being held by the Hanafi Muslims for a couple days. I actually touched on that situation on the past video titled The End of the Underworld Era. In this one, you can't see the mayor, but he is in this room in the meeting. This was right after Dr. King was assassinated. The president called on some of the top black leaders, as well as some of the other government officials. Thurgood Marshall was in the meeting. Roy Wilkins, the ex-head of the NAACP. And then we got Robert Weaver, the first Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD. He's also from DC, born and raised. And yeah, we may need to add him to the list. His story is interesting too, man. Smart man from Dunbar to Harvard. So it was a lot of important figures in this room. They was trying to figure it out. This another photo of the mayor talking with reporters after the Hanafi Muslim situation. This man faced a lot of issues in his time. He held it together and still managed to contribute to rebuilding the city after the 68 riots. But it was hard to be fair in the unfair government. That's all I got.